guys, welcome back to the CBR125 budget track bike build. This episode we're going to cover fitting a new front wheel, handlebars, tyres and a pretty big brake upgrade. And then towards the end of the episode I'll give you a bit of a preview of a pretty big mod that I've got planned for this bike. So that's coming up in the next few episodes. But for now, thanks for watching, let's get into it.
The next thing I wanted to get sorted on the bike was the wheels and tyres that I plan to use. Being a small bike, I decided to use Moto 3 size tyres, and they're also used on the RS125 GP bikes. I was able to find a local racer who had a bunch of used tyres sitting in his workshop, and he gave me these for free. I'll obviously be replacing them with a new set when the bike's complete, but for the build stages and mock-up purposes, these are going to be perfect. Using Moto 3 size tyres meant I was going to have to upgrade to a wider set of wheels. The ideal size wheels for Moto 3 tyres are a 2.5 inch front and a 3.5 inch rear. However, finding those exact sizes second hand and for a reasonable price proved to be pretty impossible. I did end up finding these wheels though. These are off a Kawasaki 250 Ninja. The rear is the correct 3.5 inch width, but the front is slightly wider at 2.75. After a quick bit of research, it looks like the tyres are still going to work on the slightly wider front wheel, and the other benefit is it has a 15mm axle, which is the same size as the KTM forks that I've put in the bike. After putting the Ninja wheel into the KTM forks, I double checked the measurements to make sure it was centered, and then measured how big of a wheel spacer I was going to have to make it work. Before making the final aluminium spacers, I cut some scrap tube up that I had laying around just to double check that my measurements were right and the wheel was going to be centered. A quick fit up and it looked to be all good. I just ran the vernier calipers over it again to double check that it was actually centered, and after confirming that, I can now move on to making the final aluminium spacers. So I mounted the tyres, refitted the front brake disc, and then began work on the spacers. Spacers complete, I could remount the front wheel. After double checking that it was square and spinning freely, I could then start to think about what I was going to do for the front brake caliper. I had to replace the standard 2-piston caliper anyway, as the new forks are radial mounted. The caliper I chose was off a 2008 CBR600. I found it cheap on Marketplace and it should be a big upgrade over the standard caliper. This one is a 4-piston caliper, and even though it's much larger, it actually weighs about the same as the standard one. The bolt spacing on the new caliper is 108mm, whereas the spacing on the forks is only 80mm. This meant I was going to have to come up with some sort of bracket to adapt the new caliper to these forks. To make the bracket to adapt the new caliper to the forks, I used some 50mm by 10mm aluminium flat bar. After marking, drilling and tapping some holes, I was able to get it mounted up onto the bike to see if it was going to work. I used some temporary nuts to space the caliper back far enough and span the wheel. Everything span freely and the caliper didn't interfere with anything. It looked like I was going to be able to use this. As you can see from this shot, the disc was perfectly centered within the caliper, which meant I could go ahead and start cleaning up the bracket to make it look much nicer. After some time on the jigsaw, linisher and lathe, I was able to come up with something like this. It's not perfect, but I think it looks pretty good, and when it's mounted on the bike it's hardly noticeable, especially when it's going to be powder coated the same colour as the lower fork legs. As the adapter plate pushed the caliper back 10mm, I then had to remove 10mm off the lugs on the lower fork legs. Unfortunately, this meant I lost one of the mudguard mounting holes, but I don't see this as being too big of an issue, as I'll be able to make something work with that later on. With everything bolted up, this is the end result. Though the bracket is definitely noticeable, I don't think it looks too out of place. I'm definitely happy enough with it to move forward with the next job. Before moving on to the master cylinder, I had to get a set of handlebars mounted on the bike. I tried for a while to find a second-hand set of bars, but these forks have a 51mm outer diameter, which limits the options of handlebars considerably. I briefly considered a cheap set off eBay, but then I decided I'd be better off just spending the money on a good quality set. I decided to get these Vortex 51mm clip-ons. They're extremely high quality and the handlebar ends are replaceable, so if and when I crash the bike on the track, the bar end will easily be able to be replaced. Fit up was fairly straightforward. They slid straight over the forks and tightened up into place. I'll have to do some final adjustment later on when everything else is fitted, but it doesn't look like anything's going to be an issue clearance wise. Upgrading the front caliper meant I was going to have to use an upgraded front master cylinder to match. This one is off a 2006 Yamaha R6 and it's made by Brembo. I got this for just $25 as the wreckers that were selling it had deemed it unusable as it had come off a crashed bike. The reason they deemed it unusable is the bleed nipple had been snapped off inside the cylinder and the barb that the reservoir attaches to was also damaged and ground down. This is not normally a part that's able to be replaced as it's part of the master cylinder itself. Aside from those two things, the rest is just cosmetic damage, which I was pretty confident I was going to be able to clean up in the linisher. To repair the broken parts of the master cylinder, I machined up a new barb for the reservoir to attach to and welded it into place. Previously there was a rubber grommet that was pressed into this master cylinder, so I figured that this was going to be at least as good as the old setup. After trying to drill and re-tap the bleed screw hole, I discovered that there was just too much damage. So I machined up a plug that I could press into the master cylinder and completely weld up that bleed screw. I'm hoping that now that this is sealed I'll still be able to bleed the brakes from just the caliper, but seeing as most bikes only allow you to bleed the brakes from the caliper, I figured it should be okay. Although it looks good here, I had to go back and re-weld this another 2 times. Turns out there was some minor porosity in my welds which was allowing the brake fluid to sweat through when under pressure. Although it's sealed now, I'm not completely happy with it and I'll probably end up replacing the master cylinder in the future because of this. I've temporarily set it up here with a standard front brake line, but I will obviously be getting a new braided brake line made to suit. At least I have a working front brake now and I can move on to the next job.
Alright, so that's going to do for this episode. I didn't fit the back wheel yet because I have a new swing arm to go in first and I can't fit that swing arm until I fit the new engine that I've just bought for this bike. Originally I wanted to put a 252 stroke or CRF 254 stroke engine in here. Couldn't really find anything, there wasn't much around. But I did come across a 2008 CRF 450 engine on Marketplace for $500. So I've just been through a massive drive to go and get that. I brought it back, it's in pretty rough condition, but it's complete and it's going to do the job. So I'm not really sure what's going to be involved in fitting it. I didn't really take any measurements before I went and bought it. I just figured I'll buy it and make it fit. So over the next few episodes we're going to be removing the 125 out of here and seeing what we need to do to make the 450 fit in here. I assume I'm probably going to have to add a bit of gusseting to this frame as well. I'm not sure how that's going to go with the extra torque and horsepower of the 450, but we'll work all that out as we go. So make sure you stay tuned, and next episode we'll be putting a 450 into a CBR 125. So I guess CBR 450 then.